Hey everyone, meanwhile, while we wait for other folks to join, could you please help us understand where you all joining from the chat? Over to you.
Sure. Thank you, folks. Thank you. Appreciate it. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whichever part of the world you're joining us from. Welcome to this webinar by AgileFever on Kanban Maturity Model. Right. So before I get started, I have a question. Right. What is your intent of joining this webinar? Let me understand that first. Right. From people on the call, what do you intend? What do you want to take away from this webinar? Anything specific? You can put in the chat window if you're not willing to unmute yourselves. No problem with that. But
No,
I'm more curious to know what you want to take away from this webinar. Yeah, go ahead. Ajay, you have something to say.
no, I've just come with a very open mind just to learn
Awesome. 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 Okay.
whatever you want to give you.
So usually what happens is the format of these Kanban office hours is usually very open-ended. We keep a very open agenda. There's no PPT presentations and stuff. But for this one, we made an exception because it's very difficult to explain the concept of Kanban maturity model without having a few slides in between. So I've made a small deck that I will be, of course, sharing on the screen and we'll be talking about it. But for me to be able to do that, I really require you to also participate because there'll be a lot of questions that I want to ask, and I want you to also ask me because there are some open end points that I've always wanted to discuss. Right? Fantastic. I know I see a couple of big shots on the call as well, so I don't want to spend too much time, talking about myself. So just keep that open right there, and let's quickly get started with a small presentation of sorts. Right? Uh, Trust me, this will not be long. I only have about 30 slides or less, and we'll quickly cover them in a few minutes. But please understand, the presentation is not from the perspective of making this like a lecture. This is more about helping us understand what KMM is, where does KMM originate from, how can you leverage Kanban maturity model, and things like that. Right. So before I get started, this is what I want all of us to understand. Kanban maturity model does not imply that there is a maturity in Kanban. Okay. Kanban is always very mature. It's pretty much mature. Don't worry about Kanban trying to be mature. It's more about the organization's maturity in adopting Kanban practices. That's all. As simple as that. Okay, Kanban is already very mature. You don't really have to go over the fact that what does Kanban maturity mean? Where am I? How mature is my organization? It's more about how mature is your organization in terms of adopting Kanban practices. Right. So think of KMM as playbook. It has a bunch of practices, certain cultural aspects, certain outcomes that we expect out of Kanban. And the whole point of KMM is to get you into that shape, what we call as fit for purpose. Now, what do you mean by fit for purpose? I'm going to have the definition at a later point in time. But for now, just assume that fit for purpose basically means you're doing exactly what your customer wants you to get done. As simple as that. Okay. So this is the fundamental part of KM. I want to make sure everybody is aware of this. This is not a model of Kanban's maturity. It's a model of organizational maturity. Basically, how good or how well can your organization keep up with Kanban practices? Okay. So having said that, this is a core mantra in Kanban. Very absolute core mantra, which is culture follows values, practices follow culture, and outcomes follow practices. So basically, all of this starts with a very simple concept called values. So if you don't have values, then your culture obviously will not keep up with it. And if your culture is not going to be up to the mark, then your practices cannot really come right behind it. And if you don't have the practices, the outcomes also will not come along with that. Right. So if you notice that the icon of KMM that you notice here, I don't know if you can notice it, just give me a second. This one over here, it very clearly says culture, practices, and outcomes. All three of them put together forms the essence of KMM. And you see here something called managed evolution. We'll talk about this at a later point in time, but yeah, this is managed evolution. Okay. Okay. So we talked about KMM, we talked about this. What else, right? So let's do a little bit deep dive into culture, practices, and outcomes with just one single slider. So let me ask all of you, right? Here's a question for all of you. What do you mean by culture? We talked about culture, practice, and outcomes. So I'm asking you, what is culture according to you? You can put in the chat window, no issues with that. What is culture? Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. What's culture?
Things we say. Peter, you've been typing messages, but you're directly sending it to me. So I think you should send it to the group chat so everyone can see. The things we say
I think
or
group
do
chat is
when we
not
think
enabled.
it's not.
Looks like the group chat is not enabled, Sharad. That's why.
Okay, understood. Sorry about that, folks.
Yeah, I like to say something about the culture. I think, in my opinion, culture is a set of behaviors exhibited by a group of people who share a similar thinking patterns.
Okay, awesome. Awesome. Thank you for that. Appreciate it, Anu. And I also see Peter giving a fantastic thing, which is the things that we say or do when we think nobody is watching is basically our culture. Right. So
I think it is collection of values, principles, ethics, so to speak.
okay.
That you know it generally gets displayed from our day-to-day activities, right? I mean,
Okay.
when we say it's a very cultural person, we know just by looking at him, the way the person behaves, him or her.
Okay. Okay. So excellent. So I think all of you kind of agree with it's more of a collective thing. What everybody does together, what everybody comes together to do. It's more or less collective in general, right? So if you notice, right, culture is all about things that we've come to accept as a norm. This is basically how things are here. This is the culture of the company. This is how we do things over here, right? That's basically this is how we live here. And then you have practices. Practices is basically how we do things. All the routine activities, the meetings, the behavior in the meetings, the patterns of interactions, what kind of Kanban practices we have. What do we do as a reflex action? What is instinctive to us? All of that comes under practices. And then you have outcomes, right? How does all of this actually move the bottom line? How does all of this actually impact us at the point where actually it makes sense to us? What kind of results can I capture? Is it really helping my business or not? All of that is part of KMM. So you notice KMM is not just simply a tool that says this is your practice, you do this, but it also helps you get to that point of outcomes. What kind of output, what kind of outcomes can you expect from this process? Now, if you ask me what is KMM, I'll give you a very simple 4-line definition. It's a very standard definition. KMM is, first of all, a model of organizational maturity. Okay, it's basically a model. So if you do a great KMM modeling of your organization, it'll tell you exactly where you're lacking and exactly where you're great. It basically provides you with a map for what kind of practices you need to adopt to go to the next level, right? And very important, it prevents typical failure modes seen in Kanban implementations. We'll talk about failure modes in just 2 minutes. Stick with me for 2 minutes, but it kind of prevents you from going down the wrong path. And at every level, it tells me what kind of practices I should be adopting. So it tells me, not only tells me where I should be, it also tells me where I should be going or what should I be focusing on. This is basically the essence of Kanban maturity model in a nutshell. There are 6 levels and zero level 0 to 4. We'll talk about the levels in a couple of minutes. So I'm going to skip the level slide. But let me ask all of you a question. Can Kanban fail? What do you think? Do you think Kanban can fail?
I think we can fail implementing Kanban.
Excellent. So okay, great point. So Anu says we can fail implementing Kanban. So let me kind of stretch a little bit on that. Why do you think we'll fail? What would be the possible factors that will take us to failure?
With any methodology to extract its value, unless we follow the purpose for which it is invented, and then we apply it to our situation appropriately, we will fail.
Wrong interpretations.
Interpretations, okay. But tell me, I'm asking more in the context of Kanban. So can Kanban fail, yes or no? All of you saying yes, right?
Yeah, if we don't limit work in progress, for example.
Okay.
The common pitfall.
That's a great example, right? Now let me add.
It can fail.
It can't or it can?
No, it can.
It can. Okay. So
Yes.
why would it fail? That's my question. Why? What do you think would be the possible reasons of its
So
failing?
you just mentioned two of the failure modes, right? False summit plateau and overreaching. We
Right.
get excited, right? Especially if you are a big proponent of a certain way of working. Sometimes we get overly zealous and we reach too far before the team or the organization is ready.
Right.
And so it's really important to make sure that you start from where you are, right? You definitely sort of take this, you should be of this mindset that you don't want to necessarily, let's say you have a cliff, right? You don't want to push them over the cliff, but you want to get them, you want to create a little bit of a, what we call, I'd say pressure, if you will, a stressor, but not enough that they can't handle it, right? So that they don't resist change.
Right.
And so evolution, right? We're talking about here. So evolution, it has to happen and evolve. And so you have to understand, what they can take and make sure that you're not pushing them again over that cliff.
Right. So what Taz mentioned is probably what we're going to be covering over the next 30-40 minutes, right? In its entirety, that's exactly what we'll be covering. So can Kanban fail? Well, the answer is it depends, right? So what do you mean by it depends, Hari? Can you give me an example? Right? When I say it depends, I mean it depends on a lot of things. So when can Kanban fail to give you the necessary results, right? One of my favorite parts about it is when Kanban is used as a tool and we don't use it like a management method. So Kanban, if you attended the previous webinars, you would understand by now, the Kanban method is a management technique. It's a method for managing work, right? When people start asking questions like, when do we stop using Kanban? Okay, we adopted Kanban, great, but when do we stop using it? And then somebody at the top will ask us, why did we stop using Kanban? So if you start asking these kind of questions, it's probably a sign that Kanban is not giving us the necessary results. When Kanban doesn't become a way of your working, when we turn to Kanban only for certain outcomes. For example, I just wanted this team to feel a little bit unburdened, so we brought in WIP limits and this team is doing a great job. Fantastic. That's about it. And then we say bye-bye to it. Right? And doing Kanban by itself is not the goal of the organization. And as I think somebody mentioned in the chat window as well, it may not meet the needs of the organization in meeting its goals. So Kanban is not helping the organization meet its goals. So because of which Kanban is, according to them, Kanban has failed. Right? Now, there are two very interesting failure modes that we talk about in Kanban. So when can Kanban fail? Kanban can fail when you're trying to do too much. Right? So what do you mean by too much? Right? We call this as overreaching. So when you fail to install Kanban, like, people take your Kanban practice at face value, they'll do Kanban for some time and then they'll say, you know what, enough. We got what we wanted, no more anymore. Then we have ambitious plans, right? We try to do too much in too little time and try to get all of the benefits in 3 months or 4 months time. Right? The team is not involved. Obviously, right? If the team has to be involved. It's you're doing all of this for them. And then again, your organization is not ready. There is too much resistance to change. People have an identity issue, meaning that, they identify themselves with a particular type of team, Scrum team, or, Kanban team, or Scaled Agile team, or something of that sort. So they're not really willing to let go of their identity and come back to the normal processes. We also have the problem of aborted transition. We've tried doing something like this earlier, but it's not working out. And then we also have the problem of regressing to existing practices. The moment the change agent goes out of the window, everybody is like, you know what, let's go back to the old ways of working, right? So one of the failure modes is sometimes you're trying to do too much. And the other failure mode is we live in a la-la land. Basically, it's a false summit plateau because we tend to think that, what, we do a couple of things in Kanban and say, we're doing Kanban. We visualize a Kanban board and say, you know what, Kanban is done. We're great, right? The people on the ground have implemented Kanban, but the managers don't really care about it, or senior management doesn't really care about Kanban. Like, you know what, they are doing it, let them do it. It's working fine for them. We don't have to get involved in this process, right? We wanted to use Kanban only to make sure that we don't get the pressure, and we wanted to kind of have sort of a deferred commitment process. So we brought in Kanban, but now, yeah. And similarly, we wanted to get Kanban only for transparency and collaboration. We got that part enough for us. We just don't want any more stuff. All of this is part of what we call as the failure modes of Kanban. All of this basically leads to failure modes. Now, Kanban maturity model helps you prevent these failure modes in general. Okay, how? Now, here's a very, very important point I want to highlight, which is there is no such thing as bad Kanban. I'm sorry, please read this as, not as ask. My apologies. Yeah, there's no such thing as bad Kanban. Only inappropriate practice adoption. Okay, you not being able to adopt certain practices is probably one of the reasons why Kanban is not working out well for you. Okay, so now what I'm going to talk about is something very, very interesting. I wouldn't call it levels. I put in a slide called levels, but actually it's not levels, but I want to talk about something else. So I'm going to just skip this one and go to this one, right? So let's talk about what happens when people get started with Kanban. In generally, when they get started with Kanban, everybody's starting point is usually a simple to-do, doing, done board. Like they have a board, everybody puts in their work items on the to-do section, and then they do something, and then they get it done and they move. And their first move is usually limiting their work in progress, which is great. But what happens is at this point in time, people usually misinterpret one of the philosophies of Kanban as a management method is that we think we are managing people. But actually, we're not supposed to be managing people in Kanban. We're supposed to be managing work. So there's a lot of misinterpretation that goes on there where we start looking at efficiencies, utilization. There is some relief. Individuals feel like, you know what, I think I have some control over this, but the entire system is not working for your advantage. It's basically, you know, individuals optimizing their own performance. Right? So a team that's just getting started off with Kanban would look something like this. You know, you have swim lanes and every person has a lane on the board. You can see this, every person has one small swim lane for themselves. Everybody's working on some ticket. And you can see there is a WIP limit at the top, WIP, work in progress limit at the top. That says 3 per person, 3 per person, great. So no person will be handling more than 3 tickets at any given point in time. Right? This is typically how organizations start off. Now, such a kind of board is usually called as an aggregated personal Kanban. Okay, so what do you mean by aggregated personal Kanban? You have a personal Kanban board. Imagine there are 3 individuals each having their own Kanban board, but now I'm putting all of that together into one board and I've basically aggregated all of that. This becomes my aggregated personal Kanban, right? Now, what happens over here, right? If you notice something, we are still focusing on individual. We have forgotten the fact that you're supposed to work as a team. We are still focusing on individual. Individuals are still coming together. We still have individual swim lanes and per person WIP limits, right? We are still obsessed with the whole, I want to make sure that everybody is loaded with work, everybody is utilized 100%. We're still in the same mindset. It's still very chaotic. Nobody really has a big picture. Everybody is doing their job. They all look at their tickets. They get their ticket done. Because remember, everybody is having a swim lane of their own on the board. And such a setup is usually very task focused, right? So nobody feels the need to work as a team. We are a bunch of people who have come together. Everybody is assigned tasks. Let me get my job done, and let me get it out of the door. That's all. I don't really care about anything else. This is a very typical pattern that we see as part of aggregated personal Kanban. Right? I hope I'm making sense. In case I'm not making sense, please do put a note in the chat window. So this is basically teams trying to work together as a team, but not working out. It's not working out. So we are still very individual focused. So what's the next step, right? The next step is basically the feeling of a tribe. We are trying to come together, what we call as a semblance of a team. The team is trying to get together to work well, right? So they're having having worked in a transactional environment, the group of people are now ready to work as a team. So now they realize that we had individual WIP limits earlier, which was great. But now, what we need to do? I think we need to have WIP limits at the team level. Let's try to get in some WIP limits at the team level. And we all believe, collectively, everybody believes that we should stop overcommitting and overburdening and let everybody look at the big picture, right? At this point in time as well, there is still no awareness about a customer. We don't really have a handle on who is the customer, why are we doing it for him or her, right? What kind of workflow do we have? We are still in a very rudimentary kind of a process. So what does rudimentary look like, right? It looks something like this. This is called as a team Kanban board, where the team is managing their work, and you can see, there are magnets or icons assigned to each person. You can see there's backlog, there's next, there's in progress, there's done, and you see backlog and done. They have an infinite WIP limit, basically meaning it's an unending queue. It's a never-ending queue. You can keep dumping tickets in those 2 queues. Right? Everybody with me? Now, If you notice here, right, the Kanban boards, they tend to be locally focused and they are more about team members helping achieve their view. Right? So this is a slightly better visualization of work. The WIP limits are no longer at a per person level. We are now operating at a per team level. So the team is now understanding the power of WIP limits. We are moving away from transactional work items like tasks to more meaningful work items, probably stories. I don't want to give it a name, but yeah, probably something more abstract, something the team can pick it up. There's somebody out there, there's a manager or like a product manager, somebody who's assigning and work items in the backlog, who's dropping the work items in the backlog, and the team is picking them up and doing them. There's somebody out there doing the whole massaging work for them. It's still very chaotic. No one has the big picture, right? We don't understand the concept of a customer yet. We're getting the job done. We're working together as a team. This is great. Everybody comes together. It's fantastic. This is what we call as a team Kanban. Right? So what's next after this? So earlier we were all chaotic. Then we tried to come together. We tried to form a team, right? So now what next? Then we have an upgrade. So now that we are following the whole concept of teaming, right? They realize my workflow is still very transactional. I'm not doing much. If you look back in the previous slide, it's very next in progress done. It seems very abstract. It doesn't tell me anything at all, right? So I want something more meaningful. So if anybody comes and looks at my board, they say, you're great, you're having a great board, you have WIP limits, but what does your workflow really mean? I don't understand. What is the work that you guys actually do? Nobody has any idea, right? So the team is now beginning to introspect and try to see if we can get our workflow specced out. So what do you mean by workflow? Workflow is basically all those activities that they do on a daily basis. What are the repetitive activities that they do on a daily basis? Can we somehow map it out? So instead of saying we do development, what exactly are we doing development? Is it coding? Is it code review? Is it bug fixing? What exactly are we doing there, right? So with this thought process, when this team comes together, they arrive at what we call as a per person WIP limit kind of a board. A board looks something like this. So you can see here now they have a little bit well-defined process. What do you mean by well-defined process here? So if you notice here, you can see that they have something, the workflow is a little bit both. You have a pending, we have a specify, we have a development ready, we have a dev, build, test, deploy, done. Now, this is still very abstract. You don't know what is happening, whether it's development is happening or build is happening, testing is happening or deployment is happening. You have no idea about any of this stuff yet. But you can notice that we've kind of elaborated a little bit better on our workflow. I am having a much better visualization control. I know exactly how many items are being worked on. I see a lot of items not being assigned as well, right? Some things to look at, right? So you have improved workflow specification, which is great. You have individual WIP limits, which are set at 3. You can see very visually, you can see how many WIP limits each person is having and how they are being assigned. There is still a lot of work on this board that doesn't have anybody assigned to it. People don't have any owners on a lot of these tickets. So we don't know when they're going to get done. And there's no clarity on who's going to get them, when they'll get started, when they will end. Nobody has any clarity on that. Now, because of the fact that we are only looking at the WIP limit per se, we do not really have a handle on how do I track metrics like lead time. So lead time is nothing but the amount of time a ticket spends in the system. But with the column set up like this, it's going to be extremely difficult for us to figure out where exactly or how exactly am I going to measure? When does the work start working? When do I stop measuring the clock? I have some challenges over here with a workflow that looks like this. This is called as a per person WIP limit. Okay. So now, this is the third evolution we're talking about, right? So now we get to the next level of evolution, right? Which comes to this question, right? But we are a Scrum team. What about us? How are you going to help us? How is this going to help us, right? Now, one of the primary things about a Scrum model is that the concept of a time box. Yes, everybody agrees that there's a 2-week, 3-week, 4-week time box that we use, right? And we have what we call as synchronized or coupled cadences. What do you mean by coupled cadences? So you notice sprint review and then retro and then your sprint planning, all of them come in one sequence, in one frequency. So one sprint will have only one planning meeting, one sprint will have only one sprint review, one sprint retro, and that's how the backlog review meeting, and that's how it goes, right? In Kanban, at certain higher levels of maturity, we start talking about decoupled cadences. Can we start separating these cadences out? Can you start separating these meetings out? Does it really have to be one after the other? Can we not have different frequencies? Can we not do planning twice? Can we not do releases twice or thrice? What can we do to make that happen, right? So this is called as decoupling of the cadences. And if you're a Scrum team looking to adopt Kanban in some form, I would also look at introducing a concept called ConWIP. CONWIP, ConWIP, also called as constant WIP. Okay. Why is that so? So that the team doesn't have to change its working style greatly. I'll talk about ConWIP in the next slide. So don't worry if you don't understand the concept. I'll just tell you in 2 minutes. But this is mainly done so that the team doesn't feel threatened by the need to change things on the ground. Because Scrum teams, right? They already have an identity. They're a Scrum team. So I want to make sure that we understand that we don't want to upset the team's identity too much at any given point in time. Okay. Please explain who's being assigned to what. Example, is PH the individual working on what task? Is a reference to the previous slide, I presume. Okay. Is that so? Can you repeat your question once again? If I may ask you that.
To clarify, he means, yeah.
Yeah. Can you clarify your question once again? Okay, you can put in the chat window and we'll come back to this slide when we have to. Okay. Right.
I have a question here. At this stage, it's called a per person work in progress.
Yes.
WIP limit. Is that represented anywhere on the board?
Yes.
Like, what is the number?
Yeah, so you can see the number is 3. And I have a concept called bench over here, where I have 2 magnets sitting idle for AB. AB has 1 ticket on the board. So total number of tickets that AB can work on is 3.
I see.
Whereas you can see MN has ticket 1, ticket 2, and he or she has a ticket 3.
Okay.
GY has ticket 1, ticket 2, and GY also has a ticket 3. Right?
So in this example, 3 is the WIP limit.
Correct.
I see.
Correct. 3 is a WIP limit here. This is a per person WIP limit we are talking about. Right? And you notice a lot of items are not assigned. That's exactly the point I was trying to highlight. A lot of work items don't have anybody assigned to them. So which means these items will simply languish. They just sit in the backlog or in the columns till somebody is ready or made available to pick up. And that's also a concern for us. Work item will just keep waiting forever in that column. No, don't know who's going to pick it up whenever they have the bandwidth. Right?
Yes.
Then we talked about Scrum team concept. So this is usually seen in combination with per person WIP limit, as I mentioned earlier. So let's talk about this slightly different fashion, right? This model is called as decoupled cadences and constant WIP. So allow me to take you on a very interesting journey here, right? So look at this con WIP at the top that says 6. Right? You see this number 6 over here, con WIP and 6, and you see here committed and in progress. Now what this means is we don't care whether committed has 6 tickets and in progress has 0, or committed has 1 ticket and in progress has 5. As long as the total number of tickets remains at 6, we are good with it. Okay. Now, this form of WIP setting is called as con WIP, constant WIP or con WIP. It's found in industrial engineering examples, but we have also decided to adopt it for Scrum implementations, right? Now, why Scrum implementations, right? Now, allow me to give you a very interesting example. Some of you may not agree with this example, but it's the easiest way to help you understand this concept, right? A Kanban system with a pretty large con WIP is more or less a Scrum system in place. I'll repeat, okay? So a Kanban system with a pretty large con WIP is technically more or less a Scrum system. What do you mean by that, right? So let's go back and rewind. What do we do in Scrum? We have a planning meeting, right? So we have a small sprint planning meeting, correct? So in the sprint planning meeting, we pick up some 20 stories, correct? 20 stories, 25 stories, whatever is the bandwidth of your team, we pick up some 20 stories. And then we work to get those 20 stories out of the board, all the while trying to maintain or make sure that we don't add any more stories into the sprint while the sprint is still running. Correct? Am I right in saying that? Yes or no? Good morning, good afternoon. Yes. So then what you have is
Yep.
a concept system.
Yes.
So correct. 100% right? So are we assuming all tickets are of same value, difficulty? Otherwise, it doesn't make sense simply compare totals. 100% agreed with that comment. But my point is, even in a Scrum system, that's exactly what is going to happen, right, Robert? The sense that even in a Scrum system, you're going to have like multiple tickets. Some will be XL, some will be L, some will be like a medium-sized tickets. The same concept applies here as well.
But the number would also change, right? From sprint to sprint, depending upon what is the sprint
Correct.
goal, what is the capacity.
Excellent. Excellent. So the convib system over here would kind of equate to your concept of velocity over there. Okay, so the concept of velocity would get equated over here. We'll try to adjust it as we go along.
But Hari, maybe the velocity also at different sprints would be different. Maybe the average velocity
Correct.
is
Average,
what you're
average
talking
is
about.
average is what I'm talking about, right?
Even the average velocity based on the experience of the team would change. So you mean we need to change our convib
Yes.
based on our as and when our experience and skill grows.
Correct. And this is only for a Kanban system that is evolving. This is not for a Kanban system that is already adopted. This is for a Scrum system that wants to become a Kanban system. This is the recommended practice. Now, very good point that has been brought up here, right? This is what I also want to understand. I want you to understand that WIP limits are not sacrosanct. So what I mean by sacrosanct is, once you set a WIP limit, we are not supposed to change it. There is no rule that says that. WIP limits are extremely malleable. You can change them, provided the entire team agrees to it. So WIP limits are also a kind of a policy in Kanban where everybody has to agree to that, and then we can keep changing it. No problem at all with that. But it has to be done together. It has to be done visually. It has to be done collaboratively. Then it's good. Don't worry about it. Now, in decoupled cadence and constant WIP, what are we trying to do here, right? So you can see there is a loop that we call as replenishment. So in the Kanban world, we don't call it planning, we call it replenishment. It has there's a more nuanced explanation. We don't have the time for the explanation here. We just call it replenishment here. And then we also have the delivery life cycle. Right? So replenishment is when we are doing the planning and taking the work item from the backlog into the board and we commit to them and it gets started. And delivery is when we are basically pushing things off to the customer's environment or to customer. It's all in production. Right? So replenishment here is a very conscious act. It's very, very consciously I'm selecting what do I need to pull into the system. Right? And as I mentioned earlier, a Kanban system with a very large convib, it kind of low-key mimics a Scrum team. Okay, so just keep this in mind. This is just for information. I just wanted to make sure it's interesting enough to understand why we use this concept of constant WIP so that you can play around with it.
All right, quick one. I've got a quick question.
Sure.
So my question is around changing WIP limits. You did say earlier that the team can change, or you can change your WIP limits.
Right.
Do you change your WIP limits whilst you notice that, oh, there's a bottleneck? Or is it like, maybe for an example, your team has a retrospective, and during that retrospective, you're able to see that, oh, so in that sprint, for an example, or during that iteration, we noticed that maybe we had a 3 WIP limit, for an example, for in progress, but we see that from a capacity perspective, we're able to take on more than 3, for an example. Maybe we want to experiment, right? And take on 4, for an example, or we want to push it and take on 5. Yes. I think maybe it's important for you to clarify for listeners also to understand that when the sprint has started, whilst you are sprinting and you notice that, oh, we've hit our WIP limits, we don't just immediately change it. It has to be something the team has to deliberate again after another session.
Correct. Now, Ambrose brings up a very interesting point, and I want to kind of highlight a couple of things from Ambrose's discussion. Okay, one is, in Kanban, there is no concept of a sprint. So what we're talking about here is, how do I bring in this Kanban practice into my Scrum team? So let's keep that conversation separate for 1 minute. The second part I want to talk about is, all of Kanban is experimentation, right? All of Kanban, all of Scrum, all of it is purely based on empiricism, which is learning by doing. So the point is, you can change it, not an issue, but you should have enough evidence to say that this is actually creating a bottleneck. So usually what happens is, this would result in you getting to the point of a retrospective, where you're looking at your cumulative flow diagrams and you're saying, you know what, if you can increase the WIP limit a little bit, we might be able to accommodate a few things here and there. And that's how this journey starts. So Ambrose is right in saying that you need to have that feedback loop. Agreed 100%. But please make sure that you are in a Scrum team when you're doing this, not in a Kanban team. In a Kanban team, there's no concept of any of this stuff. It's directly you just apply WIP limits and you keep moving on. Right. Now, so then we go to the next point, which is bunch of teams coming together. So we are now a bunch of 2 teams coming together, but we want to work together. Like, we are Kanban teams, but we want to work together. Right. Now, the problem is, both the teams have realized that they are having a great workflow and they want to adopt the workflow, which is fantastic. But how do we make it work? I'm doing something else, they are doing something else. My output is that person's input. So after I finish my work and I have to give it to them, and then they'll pick it up from there, right? So when teams start having this conversation, it is an indication that the teams are reaching a better level of maturity. Right, so we call this as a service delivery mindset. So now we're understanding service delivery from an end-to-end perspective. So you now understand that it is not enough that you do stuff alone. You have to get other teams to also come together. So this is exactly as Ajinkya pointed out. This is all about developing collaboratively and evolving experimentally. Right. So multiple teams are now beginning to aggregate their Kanban boards into one single board. So as you can see from this output, it will be very clear that one team's output becomes another team's input. But this is still not a proper Kanban system. Right? This is because these systems don't have a pull system in between. There are a lot of queues which are still not WIP limited, right? So a system would look something like this. So you'll have like this. You have a pool of ideas, and you have next, and you have development ongoing and development done. Then you have testing ongoing and done, and then you have deployment ready and then done. It's a very typical development life cycle, right? You notice here, this is called as an aggregated team Kanban. So you've taken a bunch of team Kanban boards and you put them together into one Kanban board called aggregated team Kanban board. Now the fun fact here is, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. At this stage, when 2 teams come together, are they still following any Scrum ceremonies?
They may be following Scrum ceremonies. And we are not averse to that as well. There's nothing that's preventing them from following Scrum ceremonies, even at this point in time.
Okay. Thank you.
Now, the point I want to highlight is the development team's Scrum cycle. The development team's Kanban board will look something like this. They have a next, they have a development ongoing, and they have a development done. And then you notice the testing team's looks like it takes work from the done of the development team. It takes the ongoing testing and ongoing done, and that becomes a testing loop. So you notice now I'm bringing together 2 team Kanban boards into the same loop, right? So obviously you can expect a lot of good collaboration happening there, which is fantastic. A lot of meaningful conversations. So one of the essence of Kanban, and a lot of people ask me, can you summarize Kanban in 2 words, right? I usually take 4 words to summarize Kanban. So if you ask me, can you summarize all of Kanban in just 4 words? I'll tell you there are only 4 words that I want to use, right? Limit, WIP, and meaningful conversations. That's all. If you ask me to summarize Kanban in 4 words, this is all Kanban has to offer. And there's a lot more to it, but I'm just summarizing it in a very simple statement, right? Limit your WIP and meaningful conversations. So the concept of WIP still applies, but it's being done at the team level. So every team is doing their own WIP limit management, and across the board, we haven't done a combined board level WIP, nor have we managed to get rid of these infinite WIP limit columns. So only when we get rid of all of these columns is when we can basically get this done. Okay. So with this, we get to the next level, which is basically this fundamental slide. This is what I want you to understand. The systems that we just saw are not faulty, right? All the 5 types of boards that you saw, they are not faulty. They're not bad Kanban. There's nothing called bad Kanban, okay? they're just low maturity Kanban systems. They don't have the concept of pull implemented yet because they have not understood the full power of WIP limits and things like that, but they understand WIP at a basic level, right? So these systems will evolve. Eventually, they will again evolve and they will become into great context sensitive and fit for purpose Kanban systems. Right now, so let's come back to the original definition of KMM. What was it? So Kanban maturity model is not a model of Kanban's maturity. Okay, KMM is basically organizational maturity model. Right, we talked about this earlier. KMM basically has culture follows values, practices follow culture, outcomes follow practices. We talked about this. And we also talked about how culture, practice, and outcomes, all three of them come together. We also talked about what is the purpose of KMM, which is to give me a map. Now, I'm going to quickly talk you through the 4 levels that we in Kanban for now, and then we will jump into something more serious, right? So the first level of Kanban maturity model, which is called as level 0, is called oblivious. It means nobody knows what's happening on the ground. It's extremely chaotic. Team members just do the task assigned to them. Everybody is looking out for themselves. They do just their job. They don't really care about anything else. Individuals is all that matters. So if the customer has a problem, they'll directly call up the individual and tell them they have a problem. So every customer has their own favorite person in their entire system, and they'll call and they'll tell this person, I have a problem, can you fix it? That's level 0 for us. And this is the same level as the one that we saw, the very first board that we saw. This maps to that level. Then we have team focused, where we basically got together into a team, and we are trying to form a team. So if you remember, the words I used were semblance of a team. You don't really have a team yet. We're trying to form a team. And the problem with trying to form a team is there will always be somebody who has to step up and get the job done, what we call as individual heroics. If somebody individual will step up and they'll get the job done, which is very common in a lot of teams. Right? Then, of course, we go into customer driven. So now we know there's a customer there. Somewhere out there on the horizon, there's a customer there, but we still need a manager. There'll always be a manager who'll step in to coordinate, to help us get things done, right? There's a lot of last minute coordination required, a lot of tension as well. But you still need managers. This phase is called customer driven, level 2, maturity level 2. And then we have level 3, which is fit for purpose. This is a beautiful zone to be. Okay, fit for purpose is an amazing zone to be, because what it means is that you're delivering exactly what the customer wants you to deliver. And there's no surprises. Everybody is very happy. Your team is happy. Everything is under control. Everything is more or less justifiable. Anything happens in the system, you know exactly why that's happening. That's how powerful this is. That's your fit for purpose system. And then we have a couple more. So we have risk hedged and others as well. But risk hedged is more about making sure that everybody is happy. You know, if somebody doesn't commit to the required work, somebody else will pick it up and things like that. There's a lot of other stuff that happens here. But usually in the KMM certification as well, we talk only about level 0 to 3. 4, 5, and 6 are left out for higher ones. Okay, just remember this. Now, this is a very interesting map. Okay, I don't want to spend too much time on this, because I also want to give all you people time to ask questions as well. So I'll just cover this map in about exactly 3 minutes. Okay, so what you're seeing here, this is not the practices map. This is just a basic map, or let's say high level map. Okay, so you can see here level 0, level 1, level 2, level 3, and so on and so forth. So level 0 is oblivious, meaning we are more task focused. We only focus on tasks, and everything is very much reactionary, meaning you react to things. Things are thrown at you, you react to that. That's all. Things want to get done, somebody will throw something at you, get done. So at this level, it's more about getting things done. That's all. Purely getting things done. Everything is unpredictable, and it's predominantly individuals running the show over here. Level 1 becomes team focused. So now I have a semblance of a team. I'm trying to put together a team. I want transparency. I don't want to be overburdened with work, right? So here I'm getting deliverables. I don't have tasks anymore. I have proper deliverables that I'm trying to work on. So like, for example, stories, right? Here again, I'm trying to work together as a team, but I still have individual heroics coming out of the process. People are happy, but still there are individual heroes who need to step up. Then I have customer driven, where the customer is somewhere on the horizon. Okay, you don't know who the customer is. You still not interact with the customer directly. It's basically, there's somebody out there who's giving you work, who's putting food on the table for you, which is fantastic. But you still need a lot of managerial heroics. a lot of consistent processes, but a lot of manager heroics. Then we have level number 3, which is fit for purpose. This is as I mentioned earlier, this is a sweet spot. Okay, for all services, this is a great spot to be in, right? Because here you have a fantastic understanding of what the customer needs and what you need to provide. So here you start talking about metrics. Here you have consistent processes. You have outcomes also consistent. Here you start talking about entire service delivery lines put together, entire organizations, departments put together is basically fit for purpose for you. Then as you go down, you see it becomes risk hedged, market leader, built for survival. So as you go down levels 5 and 6, it's more about reinventing your entire organization. So this is what many popular organizations do when they reach a certain point. For example, Accenture recently went through it. TCS went through it. Right? They call it TCS 2.0. Accenture, there was another word for it. But basically, you need to get to the point where you need now to reinvent yourself, start from scratch and build once again. Right? You're built for what I call as robustness. You're built for anti-fragility, meaning that anything happens, you can adapt. There's no problem with that. Anything happens, you can reorganize yourself. You're like an amoeba. You can somehow reorganize yourself and keep moving. That's basically your level 6, right? So this is at a very, very high level. If you notice the practices, the culture, and the outcomes that we talked about. Okay. So I'll repeat once again, right? It is not the organization that matures. It is the organization that matures, not the Kanban that matures, right? And please remember, culture and practices should go hand in hand, and they determine the possible outcomes. So there's nothing that says you can only do the practices and let go of everything else. No, your culture and your practices need to come together. So your KMM model basically looks something like this, right? So you have levels of maturity. They increase from level 0 to level 6. And then you have Kanban practices at every level. Okay. So what I'm about to show you is a very interesting poster. Okay. This is called as architecture poster. You can download this off the Kanban Plus website. But it basically covers all the 6 levels. And you can notice here, from level 0, then 0 to 1, then 1, and then 1 to 2, and then 2, and then 2 to 3, and then 3. So when all these 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, they're all basically what we call as transition states, where you're trying to get to the next level. So there are certain practices that you need to follow when you're trying to get to the next level. And we call them as basically transition practices there. That's what we're trying to do. We call those 1 to 2 phases as transition practices, and the proper 2 as a consolidation practice, where you're doing certain practices to kind of make sure that you stick to that level. That becomes your consolidation practices. So if you notice, the maturity levels are coming from 0 to 6, and all the transition practices are over here, and consolidation practices over here. And at a very, very high level, if the same architecture poster was split in a different way, it would look something like this. So the first 4, I don't know if it's difficult to explain with this kind of clarity, but yeah. So you have visualize your work, limit your work in progress, manage your flow, make your policies explicit, feedback loops, improve collaborative, you are experimental, right? These are 6 general practices of Kanban. The first 3 fall under the operational practices bucket, and the next 3 fall under the management practices bucket. Okay. At this point in time, this is all I can communicate, right? So then, so why should we use KMM, right? As a Kanban coach, it helps you build better value, better organizations. It helps you tell people what practice to adopt if you're stuck somewhere. As a business manager, obviously, you want to become agile as a business, intrinsically build the agility inside. You also have to, build the culture of collaboration, right? It's enough chaos on the ground already. You need to start building that common purpose that teams need to come together. And if you're a product or service manager, you obviously benefit from the improved outcomes, because there are a lot of outcomes that keep coming up, right? For example, you need to bring in more focus. You need to manage your changing demand. You need to manage your internal workflows according to changing demand. You need to manage your internal workforce according to manage changing demand. So all of that becomes part of this equation. So a very important point, Kanban is for evolutionaries. It is not for revolutionaries. We are not looking to change things overnight. Okay. Kanban is for evolutionaries. Don't expect to change things overnight. Okay. So one last point I want to highlight, which is the change formula, right? So because change is very slow in Kanban, we have a very simple formula for change. So first we will add a stressor. I think Taz was talking about it earlier. So first of all, there is a stressor where we add some stress, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes involuntarily. There's a stress that's in the system. Then we bring in a reflection mechanism to look at what caused the stress, how does the stress come into play, and how are we noticing that there's a stress in the system. And the third point is the leadership required for getting the team into action, or basically getting the inertia off and getting team people to act. That's basically leadership. So you need all three of them to happen one after the other to be able to execute on the ground. Right? Everybody with me? Right? And I'm just repeating the slide once again for you, just so that we are on the same page. I'm just highlighting it over here. This is basically the practices, culture, and outcomes. As part of the certification itself, we talk about the maturity model. We talk about how can you identify your maturity level based on your practices and based on what kind of evidences you can provide or present. We talk about the evolutionary change model. We talk about identifying barriers. We talk about how can you get your organization up to maturity level 3. Okay, this is basically the essence of Kanban maturity model certification in a nutshell. Now, I understand this is not about the certification itself, so don't worry. So I'll just skip the next 2 slides. So now here we are, Kanban maturity model. Any questions? Please feel free to throw at me.
I think Ajinkya has a question.
Yeah, actually, I wanted great session, Hari. I really liked it. Those 2 last slides that you displayed regarding where can we see that actually?
Which one? This
Yeah.
one? This
Yeah,
one?
where no
This one?
the model itself.
Maturity.
Yeah. So you can download them off Kanban Plus. So you can go to Kanban.plus and you can sign up.
Kanban.plus.
Yeah, Kanban.plus.
Okay.
And you can basically download. You can sign up and then you can download a copy of the practices model as well.
Okay. So, sorry, a follow-up question. I was not able to see that clearly, but when we go to the next slide where you talked about the operational practices and the managerial practices. So, is it a typical questionnaire that we see in maturity model? Because I'm not able to read that.
Okay. No, so this is not a questionnaire. This is more about what you should be doing already at that particular level.
What is expected out of that particular level?
Right.
Okay.
I'll come. So Robert has asked a very interesting question. So I'm going to come to Robert's question in 2 minutes. But allow me to share something interesting. I'll show you a bigger blown up version of this maturity model so that it's easy for us to just do a little bit of zoom in. Okay. So this is my version. So just because Ajinkya asked, so let's talk about this. So I'm at level 2. Let's say, for example, I'm at level 2. So this is level 2 for me. Let me draw on the board a little bit. Okay. I'm on level 2. This is level 2 for me. So under make policies explicit, the best thing to do is I need to start defining policies for managing aging WIP. I need to start following policies on managing defects and other rework types. Define policies for dependency management. I'm conducting a workflow Kanban meeting, conducting a meeting called flow review. I'm identifying what are my sources of delays. I'm looking at what my problematic policies are. I'm defining actions, so on and so forth. So for every level, you have certain management practices that you're expected to follow in order to be able to get or mature at that particular level. That's all. This is the essence of Kanban maturity model. So you have a lot of such, there are over 150 such practices available over bunch of things. So you cannot really jump to the final level right away. You need to spend some time in maturing at every level before you go to the last level. So that's the nature of the beast.
If you guys have questions, please raise your hand. I can unmute you all.
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, Anu. Give me a second. Let me find Anu on the chat. Anu, go ahead, please.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. Can you give me an example of a stressor? An example for stressor.
Right. So an example for a stressor would be, say, for example, during your retrospective meeting, somebody comes to you and says, you know what, we felt there were too many items on my plate during this sprint or during the course of this particular timeline. right? And so then you can start asking them, what do you think caused it? And somebody would probably tell you, I had, we didn't really follow the WIP limit, or we were not happy with the fact that the WIP limit was so low, so we decided to take more items, and then we realized we cannot take up those items. So that basically becomes an item of discontent. Anything that is preventing the team from operating 100% efficiency or preventing the team from collaborating well can become a stressor. So the idea of the coach is to take the stressor and kind of gently push it, not too hard, gently push the stressor to the point where it becomes uncomfortable for the team. And then to ask the team, are we ready to take the steps in fixing that stressor or to move in that direction? And that again becomes a chain of events that leads to you to take some action, and that becomes leadership. And then we take an improvement action item, and then it becomes a loop. So that's the loop that we're talking about.
Thank you.
To come
Any
back
other questions?
to, I had one I want to address, right? So
Go
Robert
ahead.
is Robert on the call yet, or he's dropped off? He's dropped off, but he asked a brilliant question in the chat window, which was, is it possible to incorporate recurrent fixed demands on team members? What if he has a regular commitment that takes up 2 days a week? Which is 100% correct. It's very easy to do that kind of a thing. We need to set up a policy for this, but yes, it is doable. 100% you can make do with it, where team members have 60% of their workload committed to some process, and then 40% is all that is available for taking up other work. Yes, you can model that as well in Kanban. No problem.
If anyone else has any more questions, thanks, Harry. Please, we can take one more question if you can raise your hand.
I wish Anita was here. I could have answered Anita's question, but okay. Yes, go ahead, Taz.
Apologies, Harry.
No worries.
Operations, you always have uninvited guests.
Go ahead, Coach Taz.
Okay, let me unmute Taz.
Okay.
Yeah. Taz.
Thanks for letting me at Agile. I appreciate it. So my question is, I wanted to find out how you talked a lot about obviously organizational maturity, but how does leadership fit into the organizational maturity when you're trying to assess where you are in terms of the levels that you're talking about?
Okay, so there are two aspects to it. I'm going to give you my perspective. You're already a AKC and an AKT, so I don't have to go down that route. But since you asked for a public forum, I'm going to answer the question for you, right? So leadership plays an extremely important role. So one of the points that we mentioned, we mentioned earlier as well, which is the stressor diagram that we noticed, right? So leadership is something which basically is going to be that spur for the team to act. So this leadership in Kanban is defined as leadership at all levels. But a lot of people misinterpret leadership at all levels as, we'll be growing leaders at every level. That's not the case. So when Kanban refers to leadership at all levels, what we mean by that is everybody who works in the system is responsible for contributing towards the upkeep of the system. That's what leadership means. So here, when you say leadership, it doesn't necessarily mean that a Kanban coach has to come in, or somebody designated as a Kanban certificate person has to come in and help us lead. It's more about anybody in the system can step in, take ownership, and help us get there. To come back to Taz's question on how does leadership fit into the big change of things. So for small changes which are happening at the team level, you don't really need somebody at the top to step in. This can be done on your own with no issues at all. Teams can step in, they can volunteer, they can come in and get their change done. But for bigger ticket items, for example, if you're moving to a point where I want to move from maturity level 3 to maturity level 4, that will require you to change things at an org level. When I say org level, I mean I'm beginning to talk about, can we have a two-phase commitment? Can we start talking about service delivery review, where I'm going to conduct my entire organizations, all my Kanban systems, I'm going to bring them together. How can leadership help me there? I'm going to talk about metrics. I'm going to talk about lead times. I'm going to talk about long tail times. And that cannot happen with just the team. You need the leadership to be involved as well, because it's going to impact their bottom lines as well. So at this point in time, that's the only answer I can think of, Taz. So I hope I've answered your question.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Harry. Taz, I'm not sure if she's muted herself and unable to unmute. Let's see.
Okay, she
Has
said
to
yes.
unmute again. Okay, she said, okay, awesome. Thanks, Hari. I think we are at time, and I see a lot of people here already. But thank you again, everyone, for joining today with us. I hope this session is very useful. I found it very useful, even though I'm an AKT. Thank you so much for your valuable session, Hari. Really appreciate your time with us at AgileFever today. Thank you all. Have a good one, everyone.
Thank you.
Again,
Thanks,
if you
Hari.
need
Great
this
session.
video,
Thank you, Coach.
awesome. If you guys need a recording of this video, it would be on our YouTube channel. If you have already registered with us, we're going to send it out to your email too. But if some folks usually do not register and just pop in here, if you do not, we do not have your email ID, please check our YouTube channel. Next 2 or 3 days, it will be uploaded. Feel free to let us know. If you want it on your email, please. If you do not have your email, just send your email across. We'll send it to you. Thank you, Hari, again. Thank you all. Have a good one. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.